There are tons of high quality firearms out there. You and I both know that. But not all of them, and actually not a bunch of them, will combine quality, functionality, and craftsmanship at an extremely high level. This one does. If there's one thing that the Sturmgewehr 44 showed us at the end of World War II, it was that we needed an upgrade for our combat rifles. It had a much higher capacity magazine than most of the combat rifles that we had at the time. Plus, this thing was very maneuverable, a lot shorter in stature, and on top of that, it was semi-automatic. It went well beyond the bolt action or the single shots that we were accustomed to up to that point. And as we stated in our previous Cold War rifle video, the Soviet Union was very quick to recognize the fact that box-fed semi-automatic rifles were the way to go as far as combat weapons. The newly formed NATO needed a universal caliber and eventually rifle, but the caliber was their first step in trying to get all the countries that participated in NATO to have a common ammunition that they used in battle. The British were quick to come up with the 280. It was a 7x43 millimeter. The new Winchester smokeless powder that they loaded the 280 with enabled the projectile to move at an astounding 2,600 feet per second. Britain, Canada, and Belgium all loved the 280 round. The 280 round was their thing. They were ready to roll with it. They were smart enough to see that an intermediate round, which is what the Soviets had already kind of developed in the AK-47 going forward, and what the Sturmgewehr had used in the past, they all recognized that we needed that mid-range round, that battle round at about 400 meters. This is where we introduce the villain in our story. The villain in this case is Colonel Rene Studler, chief of the U.S. Small Arms Development Branch. In the twilight of his career, Studler was chasing the limelight. There was no more war. There was nowhere for him to get a pat on the back. There was nothing for him to accomplish. And let's face it, he was looking for his own legacy. And there was not really a way for him to establish legacy. The push for the development of a NATO round, more importantly, one that the United States developed, that was going to be his claim to fame at this point. And he wasn't going to let anything stop him from accomplishing that. Studler pushed blindly for the 7.62x51, regardless of the 280's performance and the need for an intermediate round. All the proof was shown to Studler. He was able to see how that 280 round performed. He was able to see how that intermediate round in full auto was very controllable when you had a fully automatic weapon that you were jamming it into. He still wanted to have a little bit more say in that. In other words, the 280 round was a British round. The Americans weren't going to get any credit for developing this thing, and he certainly wasn't going to get any credit for going along with a 280 round that was established and invented over in Britain. He wanted one that was designed in the United States under his control. Around the same time, Studler also directed designers at Springfield Arsenal to create the perfect rifle for the 7.62x51. One of the requirements that he mandated was that it use 85% of the existing M1 Garand tooling and equipment. At the same time that we were doing this over here in the United States and Studler was jacking things up, Belgium was doing some really cool stuff in their neck of the woods. FN had a man by the last name of Save. I cannot pronounce his first name, so I'll put it on screen. Save was the chief design assistant to none other than John Moses Browning, who now was working with the Belgians. Now, for those of you who don't know who John Moses Browning is, John Moses Browning was one of the most, if not the most influential firearms inventor, a true genius in his own right for the United States. I can't count the rifles that he designed or had an influence in. At the time, Browning was working on the high power. Well, Saib was working with him on that. And actually, John Moses Browning, legend has it that he died at the desk working on the high power. Saib is the one that completed the design of the high power and actually made some really nice modifications on the back end of that. In 1947, Saib produced an early version of the FAL in 7.92x33 Kerrs. This was the same round that the STG-44 used. It was an intermediate round, one that was very, very effective in full auto. In 1950, the light rifle trials were actually held, and the FN FAL had a huge impact on the Americans at that point. The American military saw the 280 functioning, and they were like, we like this thing. But you know, politics is not something new. Politics back then was just as nasty and dirty as what it is today. And that's where our villain, Studler, came into play. He ignored all of the experts who knew weapons, who knew ammunition, ignored everything they had to say, ignored all their advice, and said, no, I don't like your 280 round, and I don't like your FN FAL. We need an American round, and we need an American rifle. And this man really screwed the pooch in this case. He was so hell-bent on not allowing better ammo, and in this case, better for what we needed, rifles from being adopted by the United States that he pig-headedly moved on into another direction that no one else was okay with. Now look guys, I'm a huge fan of the 308 round. I've always loved the 7.62x51 NATO round. I probably own more 308s than any other caliber. I've always been a big fan of that caliber. If I needed some up close and personal combat ammunition, I could use the 308. But I also know that if I really need to reach out there and grab something, I can do it with that 308 round. So I'm a huge fan of the 308. It was just not the right round for that time, in spite of what Studler was saying, doing, and really compromising the whole operation and trying to find the good round and a good rifle to go with it. The United States Department of Defense made a handshake deal with Belgian leaders that the United States would adopt the FAL as their battle rifle if Belgium would side with us in saying, hey, that 7.62x51 round, we want that. The Belgians held up their end of the deal. We had Studler on our side. We didn't hold up our end of the deal. We went with the 308 round and the M14. Friends, I am a fan of the M14. Beautiful, classic rifle. I love the action of it. Big fan of the M1 Garand. But this rifle was not what we needed in 1954. Now, the United States was not the only country that wanted the FN FAL but didn't get it in turn. The Germans did as well. The Germans ended up with the G3 simply because history had proven that Belgium and the Germans didn't play that great together. In fact, Belgium played all too well, and sometimes too well, with the Germans, because the Germans invaded and occupied them in World War I and World War II. For 5 years they controlled Belgium under German rule. Now the Germans wanted the FN FAL to produce for their own military, but after ordering several thousand of them and finding that they really, really liked the rifle, they in turn went to Belgium and said, hey, we want to build these under license. We want to build these in Germany. They wanted the patent. They wanted the prints. They wanted to be able to take the FAL, and instead of buying it from Belgium, they wanted to build them in Germany and create their own rifles. Belgium said no. Belgium's memory was not that bad. Look, occupation was one thing during the war, but Germany, under Nazi rule, the FN factories were taken over, its leaders were locked up, prisoners. When the Allies turned the tide in Europe, Nazis took everything that they could out of the FN factories, sent it back to Germany for their own use, and basically ransacked the place. They ransacked the whole FN factory. In fact, later on they came back and bombed the factory with direct hits twice. Talk about kids running the whole thing if they can't have their way, right? The Belgians gave Germany the middle finger. They told them, buy from us, we'll build your guns, or go pound sand. Germany pounded sand and got with HK eventually and came up with the G3, HK91, SETME, whatever you want to call it, and came up with a pretty darn nice rifle themselves, but in my humble opinion, still not an FN FAL. Now, once the FN FAL made it out into the world, some 90 countries over the years have utilized the FN FAL as their battle rifles. One of the complaints that, and I guess it's two complaints technically, of the FN FAL was its weight and its length. It was a little heavy at around 9 pounds, and it was a little bit lengthy, but let's face it, we had a 308 round, so we needed a barrel that was long enough to capture all of the performance of the round. So it did end up being quite a long rifle. And if you were going in tight quarters or jungle or anything like that, it was a little tough to maneuver with that long of a rifle. And you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody in infantry who is okay with lugging around a 9-pound rifle all day. Another somewhat complaint that was more of a geographical issue in terms of where you were in combat was sand. The sand, especially in Egypt, the real fine, and those of you guys that have served know what I'm talking about, the real fine powdery sand that seems to find its way into everything down in Egypt, would easily make its way into the action of the FN FAL. So FN, being, I think, the innovative company that they were, they literally imported sand from Egypt, brought it back to Belgium, and did some sandblasting trials there, and they brought FN FALs that they had done some modifications to back down to Egypt and did some sandblasting trials there. They were blasting that exact same sand that they were going to be coming into contact with to these rifles and to the action, and they made what they call sand cuts on the carrier. These were, quote, scraper recesses on the breech block carrier that removes sand from the action during both forward and backward movement of the carrier during firing. Now, one of the benefits of that .308 round, even though we were looking for an intermediate round, a shorter round that didn't quite go so far, the .308 round was a big hunk of lead and it moved fast and went far. The cool thing about it was, if you thought you were covered, if you were the enemy and you thought you had cover, it was more likely concealment, because whatever you were behind, that .308 was a very good chance of going through your cover. So your cover became concealment. Again, over 90 countries have employed the right arm of the free world, which is what the FN FAL was called, because it had such a huge hand in what the West was using at the time to somehow fight the Soviet Union, which, oddly enough, the FN FAL never really fought the Soviets. It just fought these proxy wars throughout the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. Some of the other cool things of the FN FAL, the gas control system. Really, really cool, in my opinion, ahead of its time. It allowed for various loads, different types of loads. It also allowed for, if you wanted to put a grenade launcher on here, you could actually reduce your gas and control your gas to be able to launch that grenade. So that was kind of ahead of its time. Depending on which model you got, the sights were either good or bad. In this case, these sights are not bad, they're adjustable, and I'm kind of a fan of these. Some of the FN FALs have the bipilot on here. That's kind of a cool little thing right there if you're into that kind of thing. Actually, I haven't ever used the bipilot on this one, but you know what, I've got it if I need to. The handle on the left-hand side, I like that. The AK's on the right-hand side. I just feel like I want to keep my shooting hand on the pistol grip at all times. I'd much rather be able to support everything I need to with my right hand and control charging the weapon with my left hand if I possibly can. The charging handle on the FN FAL is non-reciprocating. I think it's a British model. They do make it reciprocating. The benefit of having it reciprocating would be in the sandy conditions, if you had sand or any kind of debris inside your chamber, that you could drive that handle forward in order to properly seat the round in the event that it was not seated properly. The safety is very intuitive, much like today's weapons. I like the fact that you can very easily get from safe to fire without much effort. The magazine release is kind of interesting. To me, it looks like the hammer of a 1911. Remember, John Moses Browning did kind of assist from his grave because he had one of his assistants working on this thing. So I thought that was kind of interesting. In other words, an area where you're going to use your thumb on a 1911 had that ribbed hammer, and an area where you're going to use your thumb on the FN FAL also uses something ribbed and kind of turned like that. It's shaped just like the hammer of a 1911 and works just as effectively. So really cool design there. I definitely like the way that is. You'll notice that the angle of the handle's a little bit different than today's AR-15s. It's got much more of a rearward cant as far as the bottom of the pistol grip. I have no problem with that. I felt like the trigger guards also were big enough if you did wear gloves in any kind of a cold weather situation that you were fine. There are some collapsible stocks on some of the other versions. There's so many versions of this thing. Your recoil spring or your return spring is actually in the stock of this particular model. It recoils back into here. Some of the other, I think it's the Para model, the recoil spring is actually in the top because it's got the collapsible folding stock. So your recoil spring is built in here. The upper receiver is designed a little bit differently than what you see here. Now, of course, my FN FAL from DS Arms is not fully automatic, but I can show you in terms of rapid fire how effective this thing actually was. It had a way of taming, again, you've got a little bit of weight, 9 pounds, but it tamed the recoil of that NATO round pretty effectively. You could stand almost flat-footed and still pull off what you needed to pull off with this thing. I hope you guys have enjoyed this segment of the Cold War Rifles series that we're doing, and this particular one being on the FN FAL. I gotta tell you, I'm a little partial to this rifle. Out of the 5 that I have in the Cold War series, this is by far my favorite. I feel like we missed the boat by not adopting this rifle. I'm a fan of the M14. I think it's a beautiful rifle. I think it's a nice functioning rifle. I love the fact that it has a similar action to the M1 Garand. It's just, I'm a fan of that. I like that. It's not the FN FAL. I feel like had we been able to have these at the early part of the Vietnam War, the outcome could have been a little bit different. I know I'm speaking from a huge hypothetical because I wasn't around at that time and obviously did not serve during that time. So I'm not trying to minimize it and boil it all down to one rifle making that huge of a difference. I think there were a lot of other horrible political moves at that time that caused the outcome to be what it is. I do think the FN FAL would have made a difference had we, our troops, our warriors on the battlefield. Imagine the guys that we have fighting for us with this thing in their hand. I'm telling you, our guys are brutal and ruthless and relentless, and I think it would have made a difference. This particular rifle is from DS Arms up in Illinois. Dave and those guys, I'm gonna tell you what, people who care about their work and have an affinity for quality control and precise work, you're not gonna find many companies like DS Arms. DSA makes some of the finest rifles. I'm so happy with this model. This is probably, out of every rifle that I own, I would have to say this is probably one of my favorite. It's a beautiful rifle, it's well made, it looks brand new like the day that I bought it, and I've shot this thing many, many times. This is a reliable rifle. Again, guys, out of all the rifles in the Cold War segment, this one here is so cool. I encourage you, if you get a chance to go shoot one, you'll appreciate the functionality of this thing, how it works. You'll see how far ahead of its time that the FN FAL was. Once again, guys, I appreciate you all checking in with us and watching our Cold War series. I'm really enjoying working on this. Coming up next, I know we've got the M14, the M16, and the G3, and I believe the G3 video, or the HK91, or the Setma, I think that's gonna be the next one. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Gun District, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We definitely like to hear from you guys. And look, if you guys give us any feedback on our videos, have any suggestions on future videos you'd like for us to do, we're very good about responding to you guys. So, you know, drop us a line, talk to us, email me at paul@legallyarmedamerica.com. I really like to hear from you guys. It's fun for me to interact with a lot of our friends out there, and you guys are no different. I'd love to hear from you and value your opinions.